Good day and welcome to this episode of Focus On. Today we are at the Transnet Connecting Africa one-day conference under the theme, The Future Africa Wants. Transnet invited fellow African utilities and government agencies to a one-day conference entitled Focus on Africa to discuss short and long-term joint development plans as the building blocks towards Africa's integrated regional freight systems. Together they explored the future Africa wants by taking stock of the industry and setting out an action plan to accelerate intra-African trade and boost Africa's global trading position. And joining me now is Portia Derby, Transnet Group Chief Executive. Portia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invite.
Portia, the theme for the conference is the future Africa wants. Explain the reasoning behind hosting this conference.
Well, we wanted to have a meeting where, as state-owned enterprises, both in rail and ports on the continent, we would get together and talk about what our plans, what our problems, and how we might be able to work jointly to ensure that we have a much more integrated port and rail system going forward.
What is Transnet's Africa strategy?
What we've been doing as Transnet, first of all, as there are many changes that we're making in terms of the model in South Africa. A lot more private sector operations. We're looking at a private sector player coming to partner us at Durban Port as well as NCT, which means that we have additional capacity to start looking at interesting operations on the continent. And we've targeted ports which have agriculture and autos, which are sectors that we understand very well in South Africa firstly. And then on the rail side, our first priority is how do we ensure integration between South Africa, Eswatini, South Africa, Mozambique, South Africa, Botswana, South Africa into Zimbabwe, and increasingly also into Namibia. And then from there to pull further up northwards so that we develop an integrated rail system country by country.
What do you expect to come from this conference in terms of your short and long-term joint development plans to integrate Africa's regional freight system?
Well, I mean, our basic objectives are actually in some ways quite simple. We all buy rails. And invariably we buy rails from different players ourselves. And so one of the things that we're increasingly doing is calling each other and saying, so I'm buying so much rails, this is the design, this is the price I'm getting, what's the price? So that we could actually start looking at bulk buying, number one, or just sharing information. A lot of the countries on the continent, Cote d'Ivoire as well as Kenya, have just finished building major ports. We're looking to build new ports ourselves and new terminals. And so we've been talking to them, who built for you, what was your experience with them, what was the contracting method, where did you get to agree on arbitration points, which is about learning and making sure that as we develop, we are taking lessons from the countries that have immediately been building infrastructure.
Portia, now as we move forward, considering that the bulk of the nation's freight is on the roads instead of being on the rail, what is Transnet's CAPEX program to address capacity issues?
So in South Africa, way over 65% of cargo is actually on rail. When you look at our core operations in the form of mining commodities, a lot of that is actually on rail and very little on road in terms of percentages. In terms of actual volumes and the number of trucks, huge. And as you would have heard Osario indicating that about 8 million tons of chrome are reaching Mozambique on road. So there's definitely a need to increase capacity, both on track in terms of extending the loops so that there's more cargo that can go on rail, but most importantly, even more than that, is an investment program which focuses on maintenance on the first hand of both rolling stock, that's wagons as well as locos. But as we've already indicated, that one way in which we're ensuring that we are optimizing that investment is starting to look at could we develop joint operations where we then pool the rolling stock, because it's in the pooling of the rolling stock, wagons and locos, that we actually get greater efficiency. We obviously, all of us need lots of money to invest on the rail. As the CEO of TFR, Zamzamela, said, and was the president of SARA, indicated, that to run an 80 wagon train from South Africa through to Zambia is a nigh on impossibility, because from South Africa it may be 80 trains. When you get to Zimbabwe, you have to reduce the number of wagons to 40. So a basic immediate priority that we see is upgrading the infrastructure, the track.
Portia, now security is It's imperative. It's an imperative topic. What are your plans for comprehensive security to protect vital infrastructure?
Now, as you would have heard, the gentleman for the Bite Bridge rail company, he was indicating that on the Zimbabwean side, they have security issues, but because their system is diesel, it's a lot easier for them to protect. So they need to protect the cargo on the train, so they put guards with the train to ensure that there's no theft. Our system in South Africa is 60% electric and 40% diesel, and that's why cable theft remains a true nightmare on our side. But as you know, in South Africa, we've invested quite extensively ourselves, going for an outcome-based security contracts. We work a lot with the South African Police Services, and we are actually working quite collaboratively with our partners to work on reducing the cable theft. The DTIC is also looking at regulations to either ban the exportation of scrap, but also hopefully we might be able to actually start systematically really dealing with this problem of the theft and arresting and prosecuting properly these people.
Let's look at the private sector involvement in solving these problems. How far have we gone, and when do you expect this to be resolved?
Well, and we're clear about the fact that the strategy has got to be a crowd-in strategy. And so what we increasingly talk about is what is the infrastructure which is genuine common user infrastructure, where regulators are essential for ensuring that pricing is fair and that there's open access to third parties. So the private sector, in our case, as you know, on the rail system for the first time, will be bringing in actively third-party operators. We've always had, as you know, Rovers Rail, Blue Train, as well as Prasa running on the system, but for the first time we'll have other players moving cargo as well. And so invariably, increasingly, we see a role for private sector. And you'll see that on the port system, in the port operators on the continent, virtually all of the port operators are private, and it's the landlords which are state-owned. Our intention is to work a lot closer with the state-owned entities who are actually supposed to be ensuring that there is genuine, good quality common user infrastructure, onto which we bring in both domestic private sector as well as foreign players as well.
Now, Portia, before we conclude this conversation, is there anything else that you would like to highlight that is parallel to this conference?
Well, as you also, one of the things that you would have definitely heard is around how do we ensure that there's enabling policies around us. So one of the biggest constraints, and you would have heard the CEO of MPDC indicating this, Osario Lucas, that we actually need to have soft borders for freight. And our first priority is just soft borders for freight so that we can easily move freight across our individual borders. Number one. Number two is also electronic documentation, because if we did that, we would improve the efficiency of the flows. And that would take us quite far down the line in terms of ensuring that there's greater integration and more volumes of cargo being moved amongst ourselves.
And joining me now is Osorio Lucas, CEO Maputo Port Development Company. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Osorio, so how do we simplify trade and exports within the African continent?
I think one way of, nothing is that simple, but one way of simplifying is thinking in integrating our systems, not only ports, but the connecting infrastructures like roads and railways, and eventually start thinking digital, so that some of those physical barriers that split between different African countries are made easier by integrating systems that make the borders operate like a single border, even if physically they are not yet a single border. That would be a step forward. And also probably start thinking collectively, identifying the markets that are more closer or more efficient in using one or other port, irrelevant of being inside that country or in a neighboring country.
And how can ports be more collaborative with African governments to ease or resolve customs and tax challenges?
No, you see, if we want to have an integrated market, we need to remove those so-called soft barriers like taxes or procedures that make time for trade very expensive. So it is important that we start integrating some of our regulations. For example, there is no reason that two countries with borders have different customs regulations unless they have to, they are protectionists, but I don't think that's the aim. So the best idea is to start seeing where we can integrate regulation, where we can integrate procedures, and eventually how and where we can integrate systems as well, so that we start looking at our markets as common markets rather than different countries and different markets.
Now, in terms of Maputo Trench or corridor creation, with assistance of Transnet National Ports Association, how does the joint efforts help with transport efficiency?
No, look, our port specifically is a transit port. And 90% of the exports made through that port are 90%. They come from South Africa. And they are either by rail or road. Unfortunately, we export a lot of minerals, and those minerals come by road more than rail. So Transnet has a very important role to play in helping to move some cargo from road to rail, which is environmentally sound and it's good from a safety point of view. So Transnet has this role of trying to promote additional rail volume to ports like Maputo. On the other hand, if you look at the water side, we are going to do, for example, a dredging campaign now where we are integrating efforts with TNPA. So it's possible that two ports that could have been seen as competing ports are now integrating efforts and offering solutions that make our ports more efficient and cheaper.
And how do you foresee a growth in foreign investments with the connected efforts of Maputo and South African ports?
Again, if we expand our port capacity, if we improve our corridors, be it rail or road, they will be more attractive to investment because there is a need to use our ports as outlet for products for the international markets, as well as for intra-trade business. So by improving our interconnections, we will become more attractive to the market and we become more attractive to financiers as well that are looking for opportunities to invest their cash. And our ports have a lot to grow, so definitely it's a place to go, but we need to make our ports more efficient to then make it more attractive to finance institutions as well.
Is the MPDC looking into digitization, and how?
We are already there. We are working in digitizing the port. The port entry, for example, today is digitalized. We don't have weighbridge operators on the weighbridge. It's all digital. The challenge now is to move beyond the port boundaries and link the source of cargo, the border, and the port in a single digital system. That's where we are intending to go now.
I'm now joined by Solomon Kwenu, Vice President Private Sector of Infrastructure and Industrialization from the African Development Bank. Mr. Kwenu, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you very much for having me.
Let's get straight into it. Can you elaborate further on the collaboration between the AFDB and SADC in terms of the master plan in works?
So the African Development Bank has a funding and support relationship with the SADC Secretariat, where we support various programs. We foresee a case in which we are going to be able to support the Southern African Railway Association's Railway Master Plan as part of really the support that we provide to the SADC Secretariat. And so this is something that we will be pursuing in the near future.
Let's speak about climate change. How has the climate change impacted short and long-term joint development plans for the Africa's integrated regional freight systems?
So that's a very good question, especially, this is the year of the African COP, COP27, that's going to be in Sharm el-Sheikh. And when we look at the integrated, freight systems, which is, underpinned by railway, really having, the railway companies, first of all, moving freight from road to railways leads to significant greenhouse gas reduction. And so this is part of the reason that we're promoting the movement of bulk cargo from the road systems, to the railway systems. Secondly, the railway companies are also beginning to move from diesel locomotives to actually electric, powered locomotives. So this is another area in which we're seeing greenhouse gases reduction by promoting greater use of railways in our integrated freight logistics systems. And then, for example, if you take a look at Transnet, today they have 60% electric locomotives. They plan to actually have, captive renewable power generation, and that continues really with the climate change strategy that we're looking to support.
As we move further, how is the AFDB pouring further investment into simplifying intertrade between various African countries?
So we are the biggest champions of the African Continental Free Trade Area. To date, we've provided about $15 million worth of technical assistance to the African Continental Free Trade Secretariat to get established and also to get operationalized. But we go beyond that. Regional connectivity, all forms of regional connectivity, whether it's railways, whether it's roads, and whether it's actually looking at economic corridors, contribute to that. And we're the biggest infrastructure investor in Africa. Over the period 2015 to 2021, we invested about $9 billion in infrastructure, regional infrastructure, cross-border infrastructure in Africa. And that is significant. And that's the way in which we're doing it. And we're doing it on a multimodal system, looking at the whole transport logistics chain from ports, railway, roads, inland waterways as well.
And as we conclude the conversation, Solomon, in terms of innovation, how has the funding been directed into improving infrastructure and freight movement on the continent?
Given that we're talking about primarily railways at this conference, one of the things that we've been looking at in terms of innovation is to really leverage limited public sector, capital to really effect, the strengthening of infrastructure, the purchase of rolling stock. And we noticed that it's better to direct public capital towards the infrastructure and private capital more towards the rolling stock, the communication system, the signaling systems. We as AFDB also use what we call partial risk guarantees to get private sector comfortable in taking really the government obligation risk, where essentially we indicate to private sector that should government not honor its commitments, we will step in. In addition, we're also, not only looking at directly funding railway, we're looking at, credit enhancing infrastructure bonds, where we tap into the large capital base in Africa from sovereign wealth funds, from African pension funds, from African life insurance companies, trying to attract them to invest in infrastructure bonds, where we provide some amount of partial credit guarantee to credit enhance these bonds for them to participate.
And just a quick one, Solomon, what are the key takeaway points, that we should focus on from this conference?
I think, one of the biggest takeaways is that we cannot look at things, within our national borders. We have to look at things on a cross-border basis because economic corridors are not contained within just one country. And the planning process, the investment process, everything has to be really looked at from a cross-border basis. And so, we're going to have to think through how we actually encapsulate some of the decisions we agree to in some sort of international treaty so that, this actually survives and is not jeopardized by, for example, local customs or local labor laws of each country. We have to virtually look at these economic corridors on their own, treaty basis so that they can be efficient, they can be optimal, and they can really support Africa's industrialization.
Collaborations, integrated plans, and acceleration of intra-African trade are the key takeaway points from the Future Africa Ones. Until next time, goodbye.